The bridge we never crossed. I still think about him when I drive past the old maple tree on Riverdale Road. 25 years later, and my heart still catches at the sight of its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. That was our tree. Michael carved our initials there the summer before college, when we were still certain that distance was just a temporary inconvenience in our forever story. "This makes it official," he'd said, pulling me close as the August heat pressed against our skin. "No matter where we go, we'll always find our way back here." I remember how I believed him with the absolute conviction that only comes with youth and first love. At 18, I couldn't imagine a world where promises break under the weight of time and circumstance. The letter that never came. They say that life is what happens while you're making other plans. For me, life happened in the form of a scholarship to NYU that I couldn't refuse, while Michael headed west to Berkeley. We made all the promises that young lovers do. Daily calls, weekend visits when we could manage them, and letters. So many letters. His words were my lifeline during those first lonely months in New York. I would rush back to my dorm after classes, heart pounding with anticipation, hoping to find an envelope with his messy handwriting waiting for me. "I saw the most perfect sunset today," he wrote once. "It was the exact color of your eyes when you laugh." I took a picture, but it didn't capture it. Nothing ever quite captures you. I wrote back that night, telling him about the jazz club I'd discovered in the village, how the saxophone player made me cry with a melody that reminded me of the night we danced under stars at Lake Winston. I told him I was saving that memory, that place, for when he visited at Thanksgiving. But Thanksgiving came, and Michael didn't. His mother had fallen ill, he explained over a staticky phone connection. He needed to stay in California. "It's just a couple more months," he said. "We'll have Christmas." We didn't have Christmas either. Or spring break. Always another reason, another delay. The letters grew shorter, less frequent. The phone calls became weekly, then bi-weekly exercises in awkward silences and stories about people the other didn't know. And then, during finals week of sophomore year, nothing at all. The life I biddle, I wish I could say I fought harder. That I demanded answers or flew across the country to confront him. But at 20, pride is a dangerous thing. I convinced myself that if he could walk away so easily, then what we had must not have been as special as I believed. I threw myself into my studies, then my career. New York became home. I built a life there. Art director at a prestigious magazine, a circle of brilliant friends, a loft in Chelsea with windows that caught the morning light just right. I dated, sometimes seriously. There was Daniel, the architect with kind eyes who wanted to marry me, and James, the literature professor who wrote me poems I couldn't bring myself to love. I told myself I was happy, and most days, I believed it. Then came my mother's diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Suddenly, my carefully constructed New York life seemed insignificant against the pull of home. I took a leave of absence and returned to Riverdale to care for her during her final months. Moving back into my childhood bedroom at 43 was never part of my plan. But nothing about watching your mother fade away follows any plan you'd willingly make. The chance encounter, it was in the hospital cafeteria, of all places, where our paths crossed again. I had just paid for a cup of coffee that I knew would taste like cardboard when I heard his voice. "Claire?" I turned, and there he was. Michael. The boy from the maple tree, now a man with threads of silver at his temples and lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. He was holding a styrofoam cup identical to mine, looking at me as though I were an apparition. "I thought you were in New York," he said, and his voice was both familiar and strange. "My mother's sick," I replied, the words sticking in my throat. "Terminal." Something passed across his face then. A shadow of shared pain that told me he understood grief intimately. "I'm so sorry." He gestured to an empty table. "Can I sit with you for a minute?" That minute turned into an hour. He told me he was a pediatric surgeon now, divorced, with twin daughters in college. He'd moved back to Riverdale 5 years ago to be closer to his parents after his father's stroke. I told him about New York, my career, my mother. We circled carefully around the past, neither of us quite brave enough to touch the raw nerve of what had happened. Or hadn't happened, between us. As we parted ways, he asked if he could call me. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and gave him my number. I didn't expect him to use it. But that night, as I sat beside my sleeping mother's hospital bed, my phone lit up with his name. The truth surfaces. He asked if I would meet him at the old maple tree the next evening. I agreed, telling myself it was simply closure, nothing more. The air was cool when I arrived, autumn already whispering through the leaves. Michael was waiting, hands in his pockets, looking up at our initials that had grown distorted as the tree expanded around them. "They're still there," I said, nodding toward the carving. "Some marks stay with us, no matter how much time passes," he replied quietly. We walked along the riverbank, and as the sunset painted the water gold, Michael finally spoke the words that had haunted the edges of our brief reunion. "I never stopped writing to you, Claire. I stopped walking." "What?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. "That spring, sophomore year. I wrote you every day for weeks. When you didn't answer, I called your roommate. She told me you were seeing someone else, that you'd moved on." The ground seemed to shift beneath me. "That's not true. I never got any letters after March. And I wasn't seeing anyone else." We stood there, piecing together a puzzle of misunderstandings that had altered the course of our lives. His roommate, jealous of our relationship, had intercepted my letters. My roommate, who had wanted to set me up with her brother, had lied to Michael. I was too hurt to question it, he admitted. And too proud to beg. "I thought if you'd found someone else, the least I could do was let you go gracefully." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 25 years of wrong assumptions pressing on my chest. "We were so young," I whispered. "Too young to know that love needs more than promises. It needs courage." His voice broke slightly. "I should have come to New York. I should have looked you in the eye before believing what I was told. I thought about all the paths not taken, all the moments that might have been ours if either of us had fought harder against the misunderstanding that drove us apart." "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a bundle tied with a faded blue ribbon. My letters to him, preserved for a quarter century. I kept them all. The weeks that followed, over the next few weeks, as my mother's condition deteriorated, Michael became my unexpected anchor. He would appear at the hospital with coffee, real coffee, not the cafeteria sludge, and sit with me during the long hours of waiting. Sometimes we talked about our lives, the years between then and now. Sometimes we sat in comfortable silence. When my mother passed, he was there, standing quietly at the back of the funeral service. He brought food to the house afterward, shooed away well-meaning neighbors when I needed space, and sat with me on the porch swing long after everyone else had gone. One evening, as we sorted through my mother's belongings, I found a box in the back of her closet labeled Claire. College. Inside were dozens of unopened letters addressed to me in Michael's handwriting, postmarked throughout that spring and summer of sophomore year. "She must have collected them when you changed dorms," Michael said softly. And then forgot about them when she moved out of our old house," I finished, running my finger over his handwriting on the yellowed envelopes. I couldn't bring myself to read them that night. It felt too much like opening a door to a room we could never enter again. The realization, as summer turned to fall, I extended my leave of absence. I told myself it was to settle my mother's estate, but in truth, I was reluctant to return to New York. I began helping Michael with a community health initiative he'd started for underserved families in our county. Working alongside him, seeing the gentle way he treated frightened children and worried parents, I began to know the man he'd become. He was no longer the boy who had carved our initials in a tree. He was something more complex, more real. A man who had experienced failure and loss, who carried regrets alongside his achievements. One night, after a long day of free health screenings at the community center, we sat on my mother's porch, exhausted but satisfied with our work. "I read your letters," I said, breaking the comfortable silence between us. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "The ones my mother kept." "I read them all yesterday." He nodded slowly. And I understand now why you didn't come looking for me." Your words, they were so final. So certain I had moved on. "I was wrong," he said simply. We both were. I took a deep breath. "In one of the letters, you wrote about a bridge you saw in San Francisco. You said it reminded you of us. Connecting two separate places that seemed worlds apart." He smiled faintly. "I remember that. I think that's what we've always been, Michael. A bridge that was designed but never fully built. We had the blueprint, the intention, but something was always missing. The courage to cross," he said, echoing his words from weeks earlier. I nodded. "I've been thinking about what you said that day by the tree. About how love needs more than promises. It's taken me all these years to understand that love also needs timing, and sometimes second chances." He reached for my hand then, his palm warm against mine. "Are you saying you believe in second chances, Claire?" I looked at him, this man who was both a stranger and the most familiar person in my world, and felt something shift inside me. Not the rekindling of an old flame, but the careful, tentative beginning of something new. "I'm saying I believe in trying," I replied. "In building bridges with our eyes wide open this time." The new beginning. I didn't return to New York that fall, or the winter that followed. Instead, I rented a small cottage near the river and began freelancing. Michael and I took things slowly, learning each other again as the people we had become, not the teenagers we once were. We had our first real argument 3 months later, about something trivial that masked deeper fears. I was afraid of being hurt again, he was afraid of disappointing me. But this time, instead of letting pride and distance win, we talked through the night, laying our vulnerabilities bare. "I'm not the same person who let you go without a fight," he told me. "If you decide this isn't what you want, I'll respect that. But I won't walk away based on assumptions again." I realized then that remorse isn't just about regretting the past, it's about allowing that regret to teach you how to live differently in the present. Last spring, exactly a year after we reconnected, Michael took me back to our maple tree. The initials were barely visible now, nearly swallowed by the growing trunk. "I was thinking," he said, tracing the faded outline of our names, "that maybe we should start fresh." He pulled out a small pocket knife. "New initials, new spot. What do you think?" I took the knife from him and found a smooth patch of bark at eye level. As I carved a simple heart with our initials inside, I thought about the wisdom that only comes through living. Through making mistakes, feeling remorse, and finding the courage to try again. Some people find their forever love early and hold on to it through all of life's storms. Others, like Michael and me, take a more winding path. We had to lose each other to find ourselves, and then find each other again with enough wisdom to recognize the second chance we'd been given. As I finished the carving and stepped back to admire our new mark on the old tree, Michael wrapped his arms around me from behind. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd gotten those letters?" he asked. "If we'd stayed together all those years ago?" I leaned back against him, feeling the solid strength of his chest. "Sometimes. But I'm not sure we would have lasted. We needed to become these versions of ourselves to really understand how to love each other." He turned me to face him. "No more what-ifs," he said. "Just what is, and what could be." I nodded, feeling a peace I'd never quite known before. The girl who had stood under this tree at 18 couldn't have imagined the journey ahead. The heartbreak, the success, the loss, and now this unexpected circle back to where it all began. But she also couldn't have understood what I now know with certainty, that some loves aren't meant to be preserved in perfect, untested youth. Some loves need to be broken, mourned, and rediscovered with all the wisdom that remorse and resilience can bring. As Michael and I walked hand in hand back toward town, I glanced over my shoulder at the tree standing sentinel over our past and present. The old initials and the new ones. Both part of our story now. A bridge finally, imperfectly, beautifully crossed.